The ocean keeps its secrets in pressure and darkness, and in the spring of 1968, it swallowed one whole. Somewhere in the early hours between March 8 and March 11 of that year, in a stretch of empty water roughly 1,560 miles northwest of Hawaii, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine named K-129 simply ceased to exist. 98 men were aboard, along with 3 nuclear ballistic missiles and 2 nuclear-armed torpedoes. None of them were ever heard from again by the men who had sent them to sea. The submarine's home port at Rybachi on the Kamchatka Peninsula waited through the silence of 2 missed checkpoints, then through the silence of a third week, then through the silence of a Pacific Fleet search that combed thousands of square miles and found nothing. By late April 1968, the Soviet Navy had abandoned the search and declared the boat lost with all hands. They had no idea where she rested. They had no idea anyone else did either. 6 years later, on August 8, 1974, an American merchant vessel named the Hughes Glomar Explorer hung motionless in calm Pacific water above that same patch of seafloor. From its underside, a steel claw the size of a tennis court, riding at the end of a pipe string almost 3 miles long, was lifting a fragment of the Soviet submarine toward the surface. By the end of that same day, in Washington, Richard Nixon would announce his resignation. The two events would never be officially connected. They were, in their separate ways, the climax of an enterprise that had defied physics, geopolitics, common sense, and at the highest levels of 2 governments, the very idea that this could be happening at all. The Central Intelligence Agency was, that afternoon, attempting the largest, deepest, and most audacious salvage operation in human history against a target that the Soviet Union still believed to be hidden on a piece of equipment built by a billionaire recluse for an industry that did not yet exist. This is the story of how that operation began, how it almost succeeded, what it actually recovered from 16,500 feet down, and why, half a century later, parts of it remain classified. To understand why the Americans went to such lengths, you have to understand what the loss of K-129 meant to the men who first realized she was gone. By the late 1960s, ballistic missile submarines had become the most important weapons on Earth. They were the only nuclear platform an enemy could not reliably destroy in a first strike. Land-based missiles sat in fixed silos. Bomber aircraft were vulnerable on their runways. But a submarine hidden beneath the ocean, somewhere in tens of millions of square miles of darkness, was effectively immortal. As long as those boats survived, the threat of retaliation survived with them, and the unthinkable calculus of nuclear war remained, in theory, stable. The Soviet Union built dozens of such boats. So did the United States. K-129 was one of them. She was a Project 629, a diesel-electric submarine designation Golf, 2 in NATO reporting, just over 328 feet long, displacing roughly 2,800 tons surfaced and about 3,500 tons submerged, with 3 vertical missile tubes housed inside an enlarged sail. Each tube held a single R-21 ballistic missile, NATO designation SSN-5 Serb, with a range that allowed her to threaten Hawaii and the western United States from waiting positions in the open North Pacific. Her commanding officer was Captain First Rank Vladimir Ivanovich Kobzar. Her ordinary complement was 83 men. On her final patrol, the manifest listed 98, 15 above standard, a discrepancy that has never been officially explained. She left Rybachi on February 24, 1968, conducted her test dive in deep water, surfaced briefly to send a routine signal that all was well, and then sailed into a silence she would never come out of. Now, here is the part the men in Moscow did not know. While Soviet aircraft and surface ships swept the wrong stretches of the Pacific, every ocean basin that mattered to the United States Navy was being listened to. Spread across the seafloor of the Atlantic and Pacific, hidden inside what was then one of the most tightly held secrets of the Cold War, lay an enormous chain of underwater microphones called the Sound Surveillance System, known to its operators as SOSUS. The system had been deployed steadily since the early 1950s, with its Pacific arrays going active from 1957 onward. Its purpose was to detect the low-frequency signatures of Soviet submarines as they crossed choke points and operated in the deep ocean. Because sound travels much farther through seawater than through air, A hydrophone on the ocean floor could pick up the mechanical signature of a distant submarine from hundreds of miles away. SOSUS was not designed to find a sinking. But on the night that K129 died, somewhere in the early hours between March 8 and March 11, 1968, the system recorded an isolated low-frequency event, what one of the senior American naval scientists, Dr. John Craven, would later describe as a single sound of an explosion or implosion, a good-sized bang. When American intelligence analysts noticed unusual Soviet naval activity in the northern Pacific in April, they pulled the SOSUS tapes. Cross-correlating the signal between a station at Point Sur on the California coast and a station at Adak in the Aleutian Islands, with additional data from Air Force technical applications, hydrophones, they triangulated the source to a small box of empty water near 40 degrees north latitude and the 180th meridian. They had narrowed the grave of K129 to within roughly 5 nautical miles. The Soviets, searching hundreds of miles away, had no idea. The job of going to look fell to a single American submarine, the USS Halibut. She was an old converted cruise missile boat with an unusually large internal hangar, originally designed for nuclear-armed Regulus missiles. By the mid-1960s, that hangar had been refitted with side-scan sonar, a small computer mainframe, and a tethered deep search vehicle called, simply, the Fish. The Fish was a 12-foot, 2-ton package of cameras, lights, and sonar built to operate at extreme depth. It had been engineered by a man named Joe Houston, an optical engineer who would later become a vice president at the iTech Corporation in Massachusetts, working from a specification that had been handed to him by a CIA officer who could explain almost nothing about the mission. The specification was 3 short phrases: millimeter resolution, 3-dimensional images, no shadows. In July 1968, Halibut sailed from Pearl Harbor under a classified mission designation called Operation Sand Dollar, commanded by Commander Clarence Edward Moore. For roughly 3 weeks, she dragged the Fish across the floor of the Central Pacific, photograph by photograph, mile by mile, until on or about August 20, 1968, in the same week that Soviet tanks were rolling into Czechoslovakia, the Fish surfaced with the images everyone had been waiting for. K129 lay broken on the bottom in roughly 16,500 feet of water, on her starboard side, with her hull pierced and her sail torn open. Over subsequent runs, Halibut's cameras captured more than 20,000 close-up photographs. The images were sent to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington. Analysts there reached a conclusion that would change the course of the Cold War. There was a good probability that the nuclear missile in the third missile tube was still intact. That was the moment the temptation was born. Sitting on the floor of the Pacific Ocean was a Soviet ballistic missile submarine that had not been scuttled, had not been destroyed by enemy action, and had not been recovered. Her codebooks were down there. Her cipher equipment was down there. Her nuclear warhead designs were down there. Her acoustic signature recordings, her one-time pads, her patrol orders, her targeting solutions, her crew's bodies, all of it was down there, in international waters, with no Soviet ship within hundreds of miles. The intelligence value was almost incalculable. With the cipher material, American cryptanalysts could potentially read backward through years of intercepted Soviet naval traffic. With the warhead, weapons designers could compare Soviet pit geometry, fusing, and yield estimates against their own. With the missile guidance system, they could understand the precision Soviet planners assumed in their war plans. The whole package was, as one senior intelligence official put it, a Rosetta Stone. The only problem was that no one on Earth knew how to lift a 2,000-ton submarine from 16,500 feet of water. And so for almost a year, the question circulated quietly inside the United States government. Could it be done? The Navy, which had its own deep submergence program, leaned toward a smaller and more incremental approach, perhaps cutting and recovering specific sections with submersibles. The CIA wanted something else entirely. The agency's deputy director for science and technology, a self-taught North Carolina engineer named Carl Duckett, pushed for an approach that almost no one else in Washington thought possible: lift the entire forward section in a single piece. On April 1, 1969, Deputy Secretary of Defense David Packard wrote to the Director of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms, formally inviting the agency to take the lead on the recovery problem. Helms accepted. He placed the program inside a tightly controlled compartment with the cover word Jennifer, which is why the operation has so often been incorrectly called Project Jennifer in the press. The actual code name was AZORIAN. In August 1969, President Nixon personally approved the establishment of a special task force. On November 3, 1969, 2 CIA officers walked unannounced into the office of Curtis Crook, the vice president of engineering at a deep ocean drilling firm called Global Marine in Los Angeles. Crook later described the moment with characteristic directness. They walked in his door and closed it. His office door was never shut. They wanted to know if his company could build something to lift something of so many tons and in about 15 to 20,000 feet of water. He told them yes. To understand why the engineering was so daunting, consider what 16,500 feet of water actually means. The pressure at that depth is roughly 7,350 pounds per square inch, about 500 times the pressure at sea level. Any structure lowered to that depth has to survive crushing forces that would flatten almost any hollow object built to ordinary specifications. The deepest prior submarine salvage in history had been the USS Squalus, raised from 243 feet in 1939. AZORIAN proposed to recover a 2,000-ton object from a depth 70 times greater. The agency's own initial estimate of the probability of success was approximately 10%. They went forward anyway. The plan that emerged was elegant in its outline and almost insane in its detail. A purpose-built ship, carrying a derrick capable of supporting thousands of tons, would assemble a steel pipe string almost 3 miles long, lower a custom-designed capture vehicle to the seafloor, position the vehicle over the wreck, drive a set of grabber arms beneath the submarine's hull, lift the boat by its own structural strong back, and reel the entire assembly back through a flooded chamber inside the ship, called a moon pool, that could be sealed and pumped dry to hide the recovered submarine from any observer. The capture vehicle was nicknamed Clementine. The ship was named the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Together they represented the most advanced piece of marine engineering ever built, on a scale that has still not been matched by any civilian or military vessel anywhere in the world. The reason the ship was called Hughes was that the entire operation needed a cover story so durable that even the engineers building the equipment could not be allowed to know what they were really doing. The cover the agency chose was deep ocean mining. Since the 1870s, it had been known that the floor of the deep Pacific is sprinkled with nodules of manganese, nickel, copper, and cobalt. By the late 1960s, several major industrial concerns were genuinely investigating whether these nodules could be commercially harvested. Deep-sea mining was real, it was speculative, and it was the perfect place to hide a covert submarine recovery. To anchor the cover, the agency turned to Howard Hughes. By 1970, Hughes was a recluse in physical and mental decline, communicating only through a small circle of aides. He was also one of the most secretive private industrialists in the world, owner of a constellation of privately held companies that disclosed almost nothing publicly, with a long history of grandiose engineering projects, including the enormous flying boat called the Spruce Goose. If anyone in America was going to spend several $100 million on a piece of marine engineering for an industry that did not yet exist, Howard Hughes was the most plausible candidate alive. The Summa Corporation, the successor to his Hughes Tool Company holdings, became the public owner of the new ship. Hughes himself was almost certainly never personally involved in the operation. His name was The Wall. Construction began at Sun Shipbuilding and Drydock in Chester, Pennsylvania, with the keel laid on November 16, 1971. The vessel that took shape was unlike any ship before her. She was 618 feet long. She displaced over 50,000 tons fully loaded. At her center, occupying nearly a third of her length, was the moon pool, a flooded internal chamber 199 feet long and 74 feet wide, sealed at its bottom by 2 enormous sliding gates, each about 80 feet wide and 98 feet long, riding on tracks beneath the hull. When the gates were closed and the chamber pumped dry, the moon pool could conceal an entire 138-foot section of submarine inside the ship, invisible to any reconnaissance, satellite, helicopter, or passing vessel. Above the moon pool stood a derrick that rose roughly 116 feet above the deck. Beneath the derrick, a 40 by 40-foot platform mounted on 4 massive gimbal bearings, with a combined load capacity of 20,000 tons, isolated the suspended pipe string from the ship's pitch and roll. A heave compensator, working as a giant hydraulic spring, isolated the load from the ship's vertical motion through the ocean swell. Two 200-foot docking legs, one forward and one aft of the moon pool, would extend downward through the open gates to capture the lifted vehicle as it rose toward the ship. The pipe string itself was a tapered tower of steel, assembled in 60-foot doubles, tested at a custom rig capable of applying more than 10,000 tons of tensile load. Curtis Crook had consulted the United States Army division that had once manufactured battleship gun barrels, because no one else in American industry had ever forged steel cylinders to those specifications. While the Glomar Explorer took shape in Pennsylvania, the capture vehicle itself was being built in California, inside a covered submersible barge called the Hughes Mining Barge 1. The barge was constructed at the National Steel and Shipbuilding Company in San Diego and then towed to a Lockheed Marine facility at Redwood City on the southern shore of San Francisco Bay. There, under a retractable roof and behind tightly controlled security perimeters, Lockheed Ocean Systems engineers fabricated Clementine. The capture vehicle was about 180 feet long by 58 feet wide. It weighed roughly 2,170 tons in air and nearly 1,900 tons in seawater. Its central strong back consisted of two enormous steel beams of 2-inch maraging steel plate, each 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide. 8 hydraulically operated grabber arms extended from this strong back, configured asymmetrically because K-129 lay tilted on her starboard side, with 5 arms on the port side and 3 on the starboard. 2 additional outboard beams supported a steel net designed to catch any nuclear missile that might slide free of the wreck during the lift. Surface seawater, pumped down through the bore of the lift pipe, served as the hydraulic fluid for the entire vehicle, supplied by 2 1,600-horsepower drilling pumps on the ship above. The strong back carried 26 lights, 12 cameras, 8 alignment thrusters, 2 electric yaw thrusters to keep the vehicle from unscrewing itself from the pipe, and 4 telescoping breakout legs at the corners, 10 feet in diameter and able to extend 40 feet, capable of exerting more than 2,000 tons of force to free the captured submarine from the seafloor sediment. In April and May 1974, with the ship outfitting in Long Beach, California, the time came to mate Clementine to the Glomar Explorer. The maneuver chosen was called the Catalina Transfer, and it remains, to this day, one of the most extraordinary covert engineering operations ever performed within sight of an American beach. The Hughes Mining Barge 1 was towed from Redwood City down the California coast to a position near the Isthmus of Catalina Island, off the Los Angeles shoreline. There, in shallow water, the barge submerged itself onto pre-installed seafloor support piers. The Glomar Explorer maneuvered above the barge. The barge's retractable roof rolled open. The Glomar Explorer's docking legs reached down through her own moon pool, engaged Clementine on the barge below, and lifted the capture vehicle up into the ship's belly. The barge then resurfaced, empty. The whole operation took place in clear view of recreational boaters and tourists on Catalina Island. None of them noticed. None of them knew what they were looking at. The chief naval architect on the Hughes Glomar Explorer was a man named John R. Graham, working for Global Marine. He had spent the better part of a decade designing every major system on the ship: the moon pool, the gimbal, the heave compensator, the docking legs, the derrick, the pipe handling system. He was, by the spring of 1974, terminally ill. The men who worked alongside him understood that he was not going to live to see his ship complete its mission. He pressed on regardless. He would not get the ending he hoped for, but he would get an ending no engineer in American history has ever received. In June 1974, with all final approvals in hand, the Glomar Explorer departed Long Beach. The 40 Committee, the small interagency body that approved sensitive covert actions, chaired by Henry Kissinger, had finally signed off on June 5, 1974, in a meeting where Admiral Thomas Maurer told the committee plainly that the cryptographic equipment was the most important target, more important than any nuclear material. 2 days later, on June 7, 1974, President Nixon personally authorized the recovery, with the single proviso that the ship not begin actual lifting operations until after his planned summit in Moscow with Leonid Brezhnev, scheduled for late June and early July. On June 20, 1974, the Glomar Explorer left port with 178 men aboard. She arrived on station 3,008 nautical miles later at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, local time, on July 4, 1974, American Independence Day. Below her keel, 3 miles down, lay K-129. She was not alone for long. On July 18, 1974, a Soviet missile range instrumentation ship called the Chazhma arrived. The Chazhma was a Project 1130 vessel, 459 feet long, based at Petropavlovsk on Kamchatka, and she carried a Kamov Ka-25 helicopter, the type the Americans called Hormone. She had been supporting a Soviet space launch operation when she was redirected to investigate the strange American mining ship that had appeared in international waters between Hawaii and the Aleutians. At about 4 in the morning local time, she closed within sight. By mid-afternoon, she had closed to within a single nautical mile. Her crew began photographing the Glomar Explorer from her boat deck with binocular cameras. At 3:40 in the afternoon, her helicopter launched. For roughly an hour, the Soviet helicopter made low passes over the Glomar Explorer, photographing every angle of the ship, the derrick, the moon pool, the deck cranes, and the helicopter pad. The American mission director, fearing the Soviets might attempt to actually land men on the deck, ordered the crew to pile canvas-covered crates onto the helicopter pad, blocking any possible landing. He sent additional crewmen forward to discourage any attempt to lower personnel by hover. He alerted the team responsible for emergency destruction of classified material. The CIA's own internal history records that the team designated to defend the control room long enough to destroy the material was alerted, but, in the agency's own words, guns were not issued. At 4:19, the Soviet helicopter recovered to its mother ship. At 6:47 that evening, the Chazhma's signal lamp flashed across the calm water, and the two ships had a brief, almost surreal exchange. The Soviet ship asked what the Americans were doing there. The Americans replied that they were conducting deep ocean mining tests. The Soviet ship asked how long they would be there. The Americans replied 2 to 3 weeks. The Soviet ship signaled, "I wish you all the best," and then turned for home. 4 days later, on July 22, 1974, a Soviet ocean tug called the SB-10 arrived. She was much smaller than the Chazhma, only about 155 feet long, and she was clearly a salvage vessel, not a warship. She remained on station for the entire lift. She made repeated close passes within 75 yards. The Glomar Explorer's crew counted 43 Soviet personnel on her deck, including one woman, dressed variously in fatigues and shorts and swimming trunks, with about half a dozen carrying cameras. Soviet officers took measurements of the American ship's superstructure with sextants and alidades. The American countermeasure was a single bright searchlight, used at night whenever the SB-10 crept too close. The Glomar Explorer's mission director concluded, correctly, that the Soviet tug had only shallow water diving capability and no way to physically interfere with what was happening 3 miles below. By July 26, the pipe string had been assembled to a length of about 13,800 feet, and the sonar on Clementine made first contact with the seafloor. The wreck of K-129 appeared on the screen as an irregular hump rising out of the sediment. The mission director allowed crewmen to file through the control center in small groups so that they could see the image. Then he set up additional monitors throughout the ship, in the mess, in the corridors, where sailors and cooks and divers and drill crew could watch as the capture vehicle descended the final feet to its target. On approximately July 31, Clementine came to rest on the seafloor and began driving its grabber arms beneath the hull of the submarine, using high-pressure water jets to cut through the sediment. The breakout legs extended. The forward section of K-129, separated from the seabed and held in the steel embrace of the capture vehicle, began the long journey upward. Then, 4 days into the ascent, somewhere in the middle column of water, possibly around 6,700 feet below the surface, possibly closer to 9,000 feet, the catastrophe began. Beam 4, one of the 8 grabber arms, fractured. The maraging steel that had been chosen for its high tensile strength had proved insufficiently ductile for the cyclical loads of the lift. As Beam 4 failed, the load redistribution forced additional arms past their design margins. The K-129's center of gravity shifted as her sail rotated downward. A cascade of beam failures followed. Roughly 100 feet of the captured 138-foot section, the part that contained the conning tower, the missile compartment with the 3 R-21 ballistic missiles, and the code room with its cipher equipment, broke free. It fell back to the bottom of the ocean. Approximately 38 feet of the bow section remained held in the surviving arms of the capture vehicle. On August 8, 1974, that 38-foot section was secured inside the moon pool of the Hughes Glomar Explorer. On the same day, in Washington, Richard Nixon delivered a televised address from the Oval Office and announced that he would resign the presidency the following day. The two events were unconnected, and yet in some strange register of American history they happened on the same calendar square. On August 2, 1974, while Clementine was making contact with the sea floor and beginning the lift, John Graham, the chief naval architect of the Hughes Glomar Explorer, died in California. The men aboard the ship were told. His ashes were flown out to the recovery area and were scattered into the Pacific from the fantail of the ship he had designed before she turned for home. The official assessment of what had been recovered and what had been lost back to the sea took weeks to develop. The bow section that came up contained 2 nuclear-armed torpedoes, the bodies of 6 Soviet submariners, manganese nodules that had encrusted the wreck, the ship's bell of K-129, fragments of pressure hull, structural members, piping, instruments, and a portion of the forward torpedo room. What did not come up was almost everything the CIA had specifically wanted. The conning tower with its missile tubes was gone. The 3 nuclear ballistic missiles were gone. The radio room and the cryptographic safe were gone. David Sharp, the recovery systems engineer who later wrote one of the most authoritative published accounts of the operation, has stated that no cryptographic equipment or manuals were found. Director of Central Intelligence William Colby would later acknowledge publicly that AZORIAN, in cryptologic terms, had been a failure. The State Department official William McAfee told American diplomatic historians that the agency had not obtained either the missiles or the code books or the decoding machines. Some popular accounts have claimed otherwise. The published primary sources do not support those claims. What followed in early September of that year was perhaps the strangest single moment of the entire operation. The Hughes Glomar Explorer, having transferred her crew at sea to a relief ship near Lahaina on the island of Maui, returned to a position roughly 90 nautical miles southwest of Hawaii. There, on September 4, 1974, the ship's company conducted a formal burial at sea for the 6 Soviet sailors recovered from the wreck. The ceremony was filmed by the CIA. The film, 14 minutes and 3 seconds long, was eventually released decades later and is one of the most extraordinary surviving documents of the Cold War. The bodies, sealed in a metal vault because of plutonium contamination from the wreck, lay shrouded under the flag of the Soviet Navy. An American officer addressed the ship's company. He said that as long as men and nations are suspicious of each other, instruments of war will be constructed, and brave men will die, as these men have died, in the service of their country. He prayed for the day when men would beat their swords into plowshares, and nation would not rise up against nation. He named 3 of the 6 recovered sailors, Viktor Lokov, Vladimir Kostyushko, and Valentin Nosachev. The other 3 could not be identified. The American crew played both national anthems in full, the Star-Spangled Banner and the state anthem of the Soviet Union, in succession, in the middle of the empty Pacific. They had constructed a ceremony, the officer said, that they believed approached as closely as they could to the Soviet form, although they did not know the exact rite. A Navy cryptologist named Jim Reeb provided the translation in Russian. The 6 men were committed to the sea. The film was sealed in a vault at Langley. The Glomar Explorer returned to Long Beach. The recovered material was transferred under the most stringent security to government laboratories. Plans were immediately drawn up for a follow-on mission, code-named Project Matador, that would return to the wreck in the summer of 1975 and recover the section that had fallen back. The capture vehicle would be rebuilt with a different grade of steel. The lessons of the failure would be applied. President Gerald Ford, who had assumed office on August 9, 1974, the day after Nixon's resignation, was briefed. On February 6, 1975, he authorized preparations for Matador to proceed. The next day, on February 7, 1975, the entire operation began to unravel. 8 months earlier, in the early hours of June 5, 1974, on the same day that the 40 committee had finally approved the recovery, 4 armed men had broken into the Romaine Street offices of Howard Hughes's Suma Corporation in Hollywood. They had overpowered a guard, defeated an alarm system, and burned through a large safe. They had taken approximately $60,000 in cash and 4 containers of internal documents. Among those documents, according to subsequent reporting, was a memorandum from 1970 concerning the CIA's use of the Hughes Tool Company as cover for a submarine recovery program. The burglars later attempted to extort the Hughes organization. The CIA called in the FBI. The FBI called in the Los Angeles Police Department. As the burglary investigation widened, journalists began asking questions. The Los Angeles Times reporters Jerry Cohen and William Farr published the first story on February 7, 1975, on the front page of the late edition. Their headline tied the burglary, Howard Hughes, the CIA, and a sunken Russian submarine together for the first time in print. Their reporting placed the wreck in the Atlantic. They had the broad outline. They had the wrong ocean. Director of Central Intelligence William Colby personally telephoned the Times Mirror Company to plead for suppression of the follow-up coverage. The Los Angeles Times moved subsequent versions of the story off the front page. Colby spent the next 6 weeks in a frantic, increasingly improvised effort to keep the story from spreading further. He met with editors, with publishers, with senior journalists. He persuaded Seymour Hersh of the New York Times, who had known fragments of the operation since 1973, to continue holding the story he had agreed to hold. Colby would later describe his effort, in a stenographically recorded telephone conversation with Brent Scowcroft, as the weirdest conspiracy in town. An American conspiracy in which the CIA and most of the major American news organizations were jointly suppressing a story that one of the smaller wire services or radio networks would inevitably break first. On the afternoon of March 18, 1975, when 2 of Jack Anderson's reporters reached him by phone, Colby would compare himself to a boy in front of the dike, running out of fingers and toes. The dike broke on the evening of March 18, 1975. Jack Anderson, the syndicated investigative journalist, had received a tip from a colleague at the Hughes organization. He called Colby. Colby pleaded for restraint. Anderson refused. At 9 in the evening, on the Mutual Radio Network, Anderson broadcast the story. He told his audience that the Director of Central Intelligence was suppressing the news of a covert operation and that Navy experts had told him the recovered submarine contained no real secrets and that the project, in his framing, was a hugely expensive failure and a waste of taxpayer money. The next morning, on March 19, 1975, the New York Times led page 1 with Seymour Hersh's account, under the headline that the CIA salvage ship had brought up part of a Soviet submarine lost in 1968 and had failed to raise the atomic missiles. A 5-paragraph editor's note explained the year-long delay. A Time magazine feature article on March 31, 1975, titled The Great Submarine Snatch, completed the public narrative. President Ford convened a cabinet room meeting at 11:20 in the morning of March 19, 1975. James Schlesinger, the Secretary of Defense, argued for public acknowledgement on the grounds that the operation was a major American technical achievement and would be perceived as such. Colby argued the opposite, citing the precedent of the U-2 incident in 1960, when public acknowledgement had forced a Soviet response that escalated the crisis. Colby's view prevailed. The official position of the United States government became, and remained, that nothing official could be said about Project AZORIAN at all. 2 days later, on March 21, 1975, a pair of Soviet long-range reconnaissance aircraft, Tu-95s, flew east from Kamchatka, turned south at the international dateline, and lingered for 2.5 hours within 200 nautical miles of the wreck site. 8 days after that, on March 29, 1975, the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin, delivered a formal note to Henry Kissinger. It read, in part, that the Soviet government could not be indifferent to any operation of raising any parts and property of the submarine belonging to the USSR. By June, a Soviet vessel had been assigned to monitor the wreck site permanently. Project Matador was, in operational terms, dead. The administrative cancellation followed in the summer. The most enduring legacy of AZORIAN was not in submarine intelligence at all. It was in American law, and it began with a 25-year-old editorial assistant at Rolling Stone magazine named Harriet Philippi. In April 1975, Philippi filed a Freedom of Information Act request, seeking all records relating to the Director of Central Intelligence's efforts to persuade media organizations not to publish stories about the activities of the Glomar Explorer. She was not, at the time, particularly senior. In her own later words, she and a colleague only wanted to know where Colby had gone. They figured there were driver's files or something. The CIA's reply, dated May 21, 1975, and signed by Carl Duckett, contained a single sentence that would become one of the most consequential phrases in modern American government. It said that Mr. Duckett had determined, in the interest of national security, that involvement by the United States government in the activities which were the subject matter of her request could neither be confirmed nor denied. It said that the very fact of the existence or non-existence of any such documents was itself classified secret. The phrase entered the legal record. Philippi sued. The case went to the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. In a ruling issued on November 16, 1976, in Philippi against the Central Intelligence Agency, the court reversed and remanded, requiring the agency to provide a public affidavit explaining its reasoning, while implicitly accepting the underlying doctrine. The doctrine itself acquired the lasting name of the ship at its center. The Glomar response. The phrase, neither confirm nor deny, has since spread into hundreds of federal and state agencies, into the law of intelligence, surveillance, drone strikes, police records, and corporate disclosures. In a peculiar coda, the CIA's first ever message on a public social media platform, in June 2014, was the doctrine's wink at itself. The agency wrote that it could neither confirm nor deny that the message was its first. The Hughes Glomar Explorer herself had a long second life. She was transferred to the United States Navy in September 1976, then to the Maritime Administration in January 1977, and laid up at the Suisun Bay Reserve Fleet in California. In September 1978, she was leased by Ocean Minerals Company, a consortium led by Lockheed with subsidiaries of Standard Oil of Indiana and Shell, for genuine deep-sea mining tests. The cover story had become, briefly, the truth. She returned to layup in 1980. In August 1996, Global Marine Drilling signed a 30-year lease on her, and over the next 2 years more than $180 million were spent converting her to a deepwater drillship. The moon pool was filled in with 2,040 tons of steel. New thrusters were added. She drilled her first well in 1998 in roughly 7,800 feet of water in the Gulf of Mexico, a world record at the time, and went on to drill the discovery well at the Agbami field off Nigeria. After successive corporate mergers, she was renamed the GSF Explorer. She was reflagged to Vanuatu in 2013. On June 5, 2015, exactly 41 years after the 40 Committee had approved her mission, she arrived at Zhoushan, China, to be scrapped. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers had designated her a historic mechanical engineering landmark in 2006. There remained one act left in the story, and it took place in Moscow. In the summer of 1992, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Presidents George H.W. Bush and Boris Yeltsin had established a joint commission on prisoners of war and missing personnel from the Cold War era. The Director of Central Intelligence, Robert Gates, traveled to Moscow in October 1992, the first serving American intelligence chief ever to do so. He met with Yeltsin in the Kremlin on October 16, 1992. He delivered to the Russian president the details of what had been recovered, the location of the burial at sea about 90 miles southwest of Hawaii, and a copy of the videotape of the ceremony that had been filmed in 1974. He pledged to return the Soviet naval flag that had shrouded the coffins. The next year, in August 1993, Director of Central Intelligence R. James Woolsey authorized Ambassador Malcolm Toon to present, at a plenary meeting of the Joint Commission in Moscow, the ship's bell of K-129. The Russian Commission was not satisfied with the American account. Many Russian analysts continued to believe and some still believe today, that the United States had raised the entire submarine and was concealing the full extent of what was learned. The American principals, the engineers, the historians, and the declassified record consistently describe the recovered fragment as the 38-foot bow section. The disagreement persists. Why did the United States do it? The most honest answer is that the institutional momentum of an audacious idea, once set in motion, can carry it past every reasonable point of caution. Curtis Crook had not declined the strangers in his office. Carl Duckett had not accepted that the only feasible recovery was a piecemeal one. Helms had not asked for a more modest scope. Nixon had approved at every juncture. The engineers at Global Marine and Lockheed had not stopped at saying it could not be done. The total cost is officially classified. Public estimates of the program range from $600 million to $800 million in 1974 dollars, which is roughly $3 billion to $5 billion in today's money. The ship herself cost approximately $350 million to build. The intelligence yield, in the most rigorous public assessments, was modest. 2 nuclear torpedoes. Plutonium contamination signatures. Photographic intelligence on Soviet submarine construction. The bodies of 6 men. No codebooks. No cipher machines. No ballistic missile. No warhead. And yet the operation produced engineering that did not exist before it. Every modern deep-water oil rig, every commercial salvage of a wrecked airliner from the floor of the Atlantic, every robotic exploration of a Bronze Age shipwreck at extreme depth, descends in some measure from the Hughes Glomar Explorer. The Titanic was found in 1985 with techniques derived from the program. The ship that was built to lift a Soviet submarine became, in her second life, a working drill ship that opened ocean basins to commercial production. There is one final question that the publicly available record cannot answer. The CIA's own internal history, written in the late 1970s and held inside the agency for decades before being released in redacted form in February 2010, and preserves on its very first page the agency's continuing position. Specific aspects of the mission remain classified. The exact intelligence yield, the precise list of items recovered, the full operational details, the actual cost figures, and the specific purpose of the mission all remain, in the agency's words, beyond the scope of the released document. The Hughes Glomar Explorer is gone, broken up at a yard in eastern China. The men who led the recovery are mostly gone too. Richard Helms died in 2002. William Colby drowned in 1996. Carl Duckett died in 1992. John Parangoski, the program manager who had once worked on the U-2 and the A-12 before being given AZORIAN, died in 2004. John Graham's ashes have been at the bottom of the Central Pacific since the summer of 1974, near the wreck of the submarine he never quite raised. K-129 herself, what remains of her, lies where she fell, on the seafloor near 40 degrees north and the 180th meridian, with the conning tower and the missile tubes still in place, somewhere in the dark. What the CIA did between 1969 and 1974 was not a single feat. It was a collision of separate impossibilities. The cover story, sustained against every form of scrutiny, was a feat of public deception. The capture vehicle, built in a barge in San Francisco Bay and mated to its mothership in plain sight of a popular tourist island, pushed marine engineering past where anyone had thought it could go. The lift itself, conducted under the eyes of a Soviet helicopter and a Soviet salvage tug, against a target 3 miles down, demanded a kind of operational nerve that has no real precedent. The leak, contained for 15 months across the entire American press by a single director's personal phone calls, was sustained institutional discipline of an order rarely seen before or since. And the doctrine that emerged from the leak, the right of the government to refuse to confirm or deny the very existence of records, became one of the most consequential pieces of legal innovation of the modern American state. And on a calm patch of the Pacific Ocean, on a day in early September of 1974, 2 anthems played in succession over the bodies of 6 men whose own country did not know they had been found. That, more than the missing missiles or the missing codebooks, may be the truest measure of what Project AZORIAN actually was. The largest, deepest, and most secret salvage in human history, executed for an intelligence prize that mostly slipped back to the seafloor, ending in a funeral conducted by adversaries in international waters. under a flag that no one watching had ever been told existed. The ocean keeps its secrets in pressure and darkness. In the case of K-129, the United States learned, at extraordinary cost, exactly how well.